Ben Lamb had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Ben Lamb had a little lamb. His queen was six as snow.
Ah, very nice. I actually had the same idea for an intro last week, but we forgot to do one.
Well, in any case, welcome to the Two Fish at the Table Poker Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Legend of Ben on Poker Stars.
And I am East Coast Samuel, also on Poker Stars.
And here
Welcome
we
to
are.
part two.
Yes, part two of the 2011 WSOP Main Event, day 6 onward. Last time we covered the first half of the coverage, which, because they begin on day 3, was days 3, 4, and 5. And then here we have the build up to the November 9 and the actual final table two-parter for the November 9.
Mm-hmm.
And last time I felt that I think I was a bit more positive on this style of coverage compared to years past and new. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, has your opinion shifted at all?
Well, we've been through this in the past with sort of previous seasons in that the second half tends to be more interesting to me than the first half, just sort of the natural tension of playing down toward the final table. We've been through the November 9. I think we both agree that we have, some mixed feelings about it, but more positive than negative. I think that also adds a little bit more drama to the coverage than there is in the first half. So naturally, I did enjoy the second half more than the first half for those reasons. I would say that, I warmed up a little bit to this sort of unique style of coverage. Well, unique for us at this point, rewatching the coverage. Kara Scott gets to do a little bit sort of more with the camera talking to the players. So it was nice to sort of hear from her. The graphics, I think, are a lot better. The, HD coverage and camera work works a lot better. The pacing is just very nice, that there's not too much time wasted in between hands. There's pretty decent hand selection, including for the wild card hands. And I do also like the sort of multiple choice sort of angle for the wild card hands. Even though I think it's a little bit, I would suppose the previous versions of the wildcard hands, it's sort of funnier to sort of see Norman Chad just sort of make these guesses out of the blue and sort of hear him change his mind as the hand goes on. I don't really like that with the 4 options, because it's, he can switch back and forth between the different options easier. Like the previous time, he had to sort of stick with one interpretation or another. So that sort of made that sort of joke work. But I still like it fine. Maybe I'm stretching that a little bit in terms of the convolution. But yeah, overall, I'd say that after you've seen a few episodes of it and you get used to it, it holds up. It holds up as a style of coverage. And if you're sure more curious as to what exactly we're talking about, we talked about this in the last episode where we went through all of the different broadcasting changes. So do make sure to watch the last episode in order to get the full picture of what we're talking about.
My thoughts are, I was pretty high on the first half of the 2011 main event. I did feel that the second half, there was this dull spot kind of in the middle point of what we're going to be talking about today. I really liked a lot of certain components of day 6, 7, and 8 I love. And then there's this kind of this hot, cold wave of certain spots where I was a bit less enthusiastic about watching. But to be fair, I have seen a fair amount of these episodes a good number of times, so that could be partially responsible for that. But nonetheless, I think it's worth mentioning.
Yeah, 2011, just to mention again, is the one year that I have the least knowledge of. I don't recall seeing any of this while it was broadcast. There's also that as a factor in my judgment.
A fair amount of these episodes were on YouTube or dailymotion.com, so I did have access to a number of these episodes. Some of them I kind of weren't really on the internet particularly for a long time, so I wouldn't have been as familiar with them, but nonetheless, it is something worth mentioning for me, I think.
Yeah, completely new for me.
Getting back into the nitty-gritty here, we jump back to episode 13, day 6, part 1. The blinds 12K, 24K, with 142 players left. Brand new tables, of course, on day 6. Table 1, we get a pretty interesting lineup. We get Mr. Joseph Jung, our favorite third-place finisher in 2010. We get the brand new Phil Collins with 4 million chips, something important to note, along with Alex Silvestri and Christian Harder. Kind of the main 4 that jumped out at me at this table as the day 6 began. With table 2, pretty good batch of characters too, I gotta say. We got Elio Lesra, a recurring poker pro on many different TV shows over the last couple of years at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Jean-Robert Lalonde, who we had a lengthy tutorial of how to play big stack poker on day 5 with, who again had kind of an up and down day 5 and was still on the shorter side of the stacks with 1.2 million on day 6. Pius
Mm-hmm.
Heinz, this mysterious, apparently crazy aggressive player of a monster 4.7 million. Some guy wearing a flag named Hilton Laborda, whoever that might be. McNiff, who we saw on day 5 on the featured table as well. So for me, a couple of pretty good tables because given how the events play out on day 6, I liked where we began on day 6 of these episodes.
Yep, and we also get this guy named Bob Bunara, who, very interesting character.
Mm-hmm. We get a couple hands on the outer tables with guys like Doc Sands, Eric Lindgren, Amanda Musumeci, Erica Motina, the last couple of women left in the field,
Mm-hmm.
Maria Clawford. I think there's 3 women at this point left, and they were given a fair amount of coverage, which again, with only 142 players left, having 3 left it's not bad. I feel like some years we're lucky to get 1 in the final 100 or so players. So to have 3, again, on Women Watch on ESPN Poker is not bad.
Right.
But I think the A plot of this episode 100% is the rise of Phil Collins, not the musician, the player. Basically, he rules the world here. He rules table 1. People dump millions upon millions of chips to him. The very first hand, we see one of the worst all-in calls you'll ever see. The guy basically hands Phil Collins 2 million chips of ace-jack pre-flop when Phil Collins has ace-king.
80 big blinds. I mean, just gone. Yeah, I mean, Collins, because we mentioned this last time that it's really Ben Lamb's show for the first half of this. Ben Lamb, he's the player of the year. He's playing pretty well. He's the guy to beat established throughout the coverage. So, I mean, day 6, changing it to Phil Collins, who also is a decent player. I mean, he seems to, we mentioned that he just got lucky, but he also has some good hands, manages to pick his spots, not like a too spectacular personality. Not that he's not personable at all, but it's just,
no, there's a fair amount of table talk at the table. He can't believe just how many chips he's accumulating by episode's end. And remember, he had 4 million chips at the start of this level of the tournament. And by, the episode does end on a hand on the next level, the 15K, 30K level. But Collins gets up to 8.7 million when he ends up getting aces upon aces, where not only does he make that big 2 million off of the ace king, he busts Joseph Chong, who has ace queen when he has aces. So
yeah.
And not only numerically is his stack huge, his physical chip stack becomes the Empire State Building of chip stacks. It just becomes a joke at this point, where in the next episode, Norm will even say, "I wonder how Colin decides which chips to use because he has so many different levels of his chip tower to choose from."
He has to reach around and kind of like grab up top and like push it forward like this. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's not to say I didn't find some enjoyable content on the table 2 action. We do get the introduction of Hilton Laborda's maybe questionable poker etiquettes. We see him literally slow roll tree win when he has the nut straight when Quinn has the top set. So, I mean, I guess if Laborda had like a mirror into tree win's cards and he knows that he has outs when he has the nuts, I guess. But even then, it's just bad form.
Slow rolling's never okay. It's never okay.
Mm-hmm. And it's an actiony table. JRB has a great line where he tells his table mates, "They're rookies in this tournament. I suggest you play poker with them." Just kind of this arrogant, kind of talky JRB style poker right there.
Yeah, because he really hates having his blind raised because he just calls whenever he's in the big blind. Any 2 that he's in the big blind, he'll just see a pot. So it's just crazy.
And then more substantially, we also do see Phil Collins in a quick interview, mentioning how, he shares the name of the musician, the role of math in poker for him. And then we do get a pretty amusing bit where we see poker celeb lookalikes, comparing a celebrity to a poker player. I thought that was amusing enough.
I liked Norm's line the best in college. They said I looked like Alan Alda.
We do see Mars Callahan on the outer tables. And just seeing him walk over to the rail like that was kind of nostalgic for me. It kind of hit me because that was exactly what my friend Adam did with the main event with me. So that was kind of amusing to see for sure, for how that played out.
He didn't like jump out of the table and run over, did he?
No, and he didn't do that, but nonetheless, the physical action was pretty funny.
Yeah.
Episode 14 is part 2, the 15K, 30K blind level. The last level will ever have those glorious 1K chips that would, clog the tables up pretty substantially by this point. 113 players left. The same 2 tables, so again, no table being broken or anything. We do see Phil Collins continue to have very smooth sailing, even when his opponent hits a magic turn card that he likes. It works out for Collins again. Collins hitting that 10 million mark, which is, again, at this point in the tournament, over 330 big blinds. Pretty awesome.
Yeah, we're down to about 100 players at this point, so that's like a big deal. 10 million. Like, we're still not close to the final table yet, so that's like a big benchmark to hit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we do see for the first time a couple of our future November Niners in the tournament. We do see Sam Holden, Owen O'D, and Bob Bunara in their sort of screen debut, 1/3 of the featured table. So that's always kind of cool to see them, even if it's 14 episodes into a 26 episode main event. But it's not as bad as Peter Eastgate in 08.
Right. Yeah, I like this episode a lot. I mean, in large part because it's Bunara we showed for the first time. He's sort of the amateur of this year, the nice player. He gets lucky. I mean, let's be honest. He flops a straight, all that. But he does play decently well. He plays, it's a game
though. Devonshire lies to him after so that was pretty funny.
That was funny, yeah. But, anyway, like what we're sort of seeing here is, Pius Heinz is really the exception to the rule in terms of like a hyper-aggressive player who's making a lot of moves. Everybody, I feel, plays fairly even-keeled poker, picking sort of different spots, some bluffs, valuing their hands, raising, and so on. It's sort of interesting to see the different play. And Bunara is sort of one of those guys sort of playing on the tighter end, finding premium hands, and then betting big. So it really makes a sort of more enjoyable season because we're seeing a bunch of different players of different styles sort of clash with each other.
I will take exception to your comments about Heinz because he is continuously referred by Lon and Norm as like the super aggressive player, and we don't really see too much of that. Now we see a bit more of that towards the end, but that was more of a tell, don't show situation with Heinz, especially compared to guys like Heinzelman or even Ben Land to a lesser extent too, or more regularly shown making these very aggressive bets, raises, etc.
I mean, yeah, that's fair. I mean, that's a fair point to make. I mean, obviously with coverage like this, they're looking for characters. So, Pius Heinz is going to be the sort of crazy German player. But yeah, I mean, I would say that with the hands that we see, I mean, yeah, he's playing. We're going to get into Heinz a little bit in more detail in a moment. He hasn't quite appeared in the coverage yet. But it definitely seems like he's playing a little bit more aggressive than everybody else. And it sort of just helps create a more varied experience when you're seeing different styles of play contrast with each other.
Yeah. And oddly enough, unlike day 5, we actually do kind of have a halfway point in day 6 in that we have a brand new table number 1. Table 2 stays the same, more or less. Obviously, players busting would change the tables up. But on table 1, we get a new cast of characters. We get Ben Lamb returns to the featured table, although this time on table 1, not table 2. Eric Lindgren, J.P. Kelly, Erica Motino, Brian Yoon, and Mama Liadis. Brand new table. Different, with chip distribution a little bit all over the place, some big, some small. And it's kind of the first time we've really seen Eric Lindgren not on day 1 at the featured table from, back in the 08, 09 days. So that was a little bit refreshing. And he has, at this point, one of the main narratives was he was always kind of a short stack. And at this point, he does kind of have a 70 big blind stack, definitely very playable and not as nearly as handcuffy as small stacks can be, certainly on day 6.
Yeah, I mean, up till this point, I mean, the narrative has been, we sort of talked about this more last episode, but, that he's always never really had a deep run in the main event, sort of one of the better players to never have a main event deep run. So here we have a chance. It's nice to actually see him play a little bit in detail. Because again, keep in mind that a lot of people who are just sort of casual poker fans are just sort of watching the main event. They're not watching the other events. Maybe a lot of them don't even know who Eric Lindgren is. So it's nice to give him an opportunity to finally show some of his skills.
Yeah, and the action on all these tables, I'd say definitely above average. We do some pretty big outer table play. Claudia Crawford getting bullied by Brian Lenahan. We see a bunch of crazy 2-outers to end in people's eliminations. We do lose Daryl Jace, who we saw on day 3. It's a big stack. We lose Claudia Crawford, leaving us with just 2 ladies in the field. We do see one of the crazier big all-in pots up to this point on table 2 with Pius Heinz, Sebastian Ruthenberg, and Vengren in a 7.5 million chip pot, where Heinz makes an incredible call with queens pre-flop, which was the best hand against ace king. I believe it was ace queen or something like that. So Heinz kind of goes from that 3 million spot up to 7.5 million, which would certainly carry him a fair distance going forward. On the outer tables, we get a fair cast, a spread of focus on people we've seen across the coverage up to this point. Cunningham, Tony Hashem, Devonshire, Matt Giannetti, Bob Bonara, Per Lind, who again will be more relevant in 2016, but again, kind of those runs, you see someone briefly in, and we'll obviously see him back late in the main event. We do have the glorious Lavender 100K chips enter the fray at this point. And so again, I was happy with this episode.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, and I almost forgot to mention probably my highlights, although not because it's in this episode, but because of the original live broadcast version of the main event, is the Hilton Laborda 5-3 hand against Tyler Bunkowski, where you pretty much see as blatant of poker tells as you'll ever see in the history of televised poker by Laborda. His entire body posture changes. His method of moving the chips is not the same on the river when he makes this ridiculous overbet of the pot with the nuts, when he rivers a runner straight. I thought it was like a gut shot on the flop or something when Bunkowski has top pair. In the live version of that hand, Esfandiari tore Laborda apart as politely and as possible as possibly could have, because of how the nature of Lon would kind of cut him off whenever he was going too far into a direction that the live feed didn't want to go into. And you gotta love Laborda's celebration. Roja! Right. I almost thought about having the introduction this time around being a take on Roja, like female red color in Spanish, but I couldn't do it because Ben Lamb was too good to pick up on that. And I gotta say, I do think the very last hand of this episode was probably, again, maybe I already contradicted myself, and it was better than the Laborda hand, because we see Erica Motino, who hadn't played a hand the entire episode, makes a all-in over shove onto a very busy pre-flop plot with pocket tens, and her tablemate Salzburg is as salty as it gets over her shove after asking her aces or kings, and we have this hilarious sort of facial shrug by Motino. I mean, just remembering it was making me laugh. I don't know how you thought about that hand.
Oh, it was great. I mean, oh my God. I don't think it's not the greatest play with tens there, I suppose. But on the other hand, she was in a big stack. You're sort of looking for a sort of shove spot. Tens is fine. Just Salzburg, and him just swearing, going over to his rail. It's one of those classic moments where someone just walks over to the rail and they've got their buddies there, and their buddies just have these mute expressions on their face, and the players just ranting and raving. It's like classic Hellmuth, except it's just some other guy. Motino took it well, but wow, it's just a great moment.
It was good. And so that again gets Motino from around 1 million chips up to closer to 2-point-something million. So definitely a bit less sweat in the short stack vibe at that point. Moving into episode 16, the last part of day 6, the blind 25K, 50K. And again, I point out here that again, each episode would for the most part stick to one level, and then often for probably the last hand, often to squeeze in a actiony, dramatic hand, would have that next blind level briefly shown. We do see, again, the same first table and table 2 as the last episode. We do see, again, some pretty substandard play by Brian Yoon. I mean, he had a pretty sizable chip stack when the splitting point of day 6 began.
Yeah.
He sends the chips around the table, some to Lamb, some to Lindgren, some to JP Kelly. Not very impressive. Brian Yoon, though, one of those guys that you don't really hear a ton about, but he's made some pretty impressive recent main event deep runs the last couple of years.
Didn't he win a bracelet a couple years ago?
He might have. I forget exactly, but
I think he did. Yeah, I think I looked it up.
That kind of baby Brian Yoon pre-bracelet, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Yeah, he's won 4 bracelets, apparently.
Mm-hmm. And, I would say I didn't have any notes on table 2 for this episode because I think for me, the absolute highlight of possibly the entire day 6 is everything that happens on table 1 in this episode.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of really impressive play on table 1. Having Doc Sands and Matino together. I mean, they say like, "Oh, it's random." Come on, like
at this point, we have 69 players left at this point, day 6, and so that only leaves like 8 tables left. And so if a table has a spot opened up, so after Brian Yoon bus, I believe is when Doc Sands joins the table.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It kind of makes sense. I mean, the odds of it are pretty high that if when the table breaks, that they'd put him there.
Come on. I mean, they had to have known what they were doing there.
I mean, I think
I'm on the scale type thing.
That's one of the parts of the tournament that has always been strictly random, no matter what. Players have commented on this that it's always random. So you can shake your head, but I'm telling you for a fact that it's true.
No, Chris Moneymaker said in an interview that they would used to at the WSOP like put either an attractive woman at the feature table or like a top ranked player. That they would do that at least for like the first couple days. Come on, like it's on the scale.
When the day begins, not in the middle of the day.
Okay, sure, maybe, but I'm calling conspiracy theory here. I think that there was some sort of collusion.
Well, even if the conspiracy you're trying to throw out there is true, I am willing to forgive it because we get some of the most enjoyable, awkward psychology dynamic table talk of all time. Because it begins with Doc Sands making his grand entrance to the table with the classic line, "The doctor is in and the clinic is open," with Ben Lamb kind of chiming in. That was just really, really kind of fun little introduction type thing. And then Amanda Musumeci busts on one of the outer tables, and we get perhaps the most cringe-inducing "last woman left is blank" announcement of all time. We get we now have the last one standing, the Erica Montina. Go, girl. And Doc Sands clearly cares more than Erica cares because she just kind of like shrugs it off like, well, whatever. And Doc Sands is like, "Oh, yeah, babe. All right. Congratulations." And it's as if it's like this, life crowning achievement, even though for her, she probably doesn't really care. I mean, she's trying to play her game.
Right. I thought it was sweet.
No, I found the contrast of how it's just kind of like classic sitcom moment of one person caring about something far more than the one that the event is about. So that amused me. And then we get a pretty funny kind of wild card hand with JP Kelly against Brian Yoon, where Norm was convinced that the wild card hand was for the other player, given the play that Yoon was doing with his ace high.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of funny. I like the table 1 stuff in this episode.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I mean, we had a decent, good amount of play, some good play, and then personality banter. It's good, yeah.
And then speaking of personality banter, I got to say that this blind versus blind Eric Lindgren against Moshnikov hand. I mean, what was your thought on the etiquette and the judgment on that hand?
So just to tell the audience what happened. So Lindgren and Moshnikov go to a flop. After the flop, check 2x. Nothing wrong there. Then Moshnikov says something unintelligible. It's like, did he say 18K? Did he say 800K? I couldn't quite make it out. But he just ultimately, the floor comes over, right? And then ultimately they're like, all right, you have to bet 100K. So Lindgren calls. Then Moshnikov, having seen all this action, having heard all this response, bets 400 and Lindgren folds. I mean, you've been critical about the floor's calls before. I mean, I don't know. Like it's a weird spot to have, like, because if you announce an amount, you have to bet that amount. That's a classic rule in poker. I mean, I don't know what you do when it's unintelligible. I mean, it's a weird spot. I think min bet. I don't know.
Well, my favorite part of that was Mosnikov's kind of like nail scratching into Lindgren's like etiquette, like, oh, so you play like this in this game, huh? Like as if what Eric was saying was in some way poor sportsmanship, which I couldn't disagree with more. I don't think that was wrong at all. Eric Lindgren was like, you can bet whatever you want, I don't care.
Right. Yeah.
Because at that time, Eric Lindgren had the best hand, and then on the river, obviously, it turns against him.
Mm-hmm.
But so basically, E-Dog, our boy E-Dog, gets screwed by the whole hand. Yeah, luckily, it was a smallish pot, blind versus blind, but nonetheless, E-Dog, given how his final financial turnout, every chip matters. So
yeah. I mean, it's a weird spot.
mm-hmm. There on our tables, we see we lose Alan Cunningham. We do see a pretty crazy $8 million poker flip with Ryan Linehan against Mr. I Had Fun, I Call, where he was somehow right to call in pre-flop, where Linehan wins that flip and hits the chip lead of 12 million chips, which, again, surpasses even Phil Collins, who had really kind of plateaued in the 8-9 million chip level after his climb on the feature table. And we do see on the very last hand of the episode the house chip lead exchange hands, with Doc Sands having always had the fewer chips at the end of each day of the tournament up until that point compared to Erica. We do see Sands win a fairly sizable hand against Eric Lindgren, who ends up losing a fair number of his stack. And Doc Sands, it reclaims the house chip lead. And then instantly says, babe, I'm really proud of you. He's trying to like brag and then like cover it up by being supportive.
It's a great moment.
She just ignores him. Like she doesn't even like look at him or respond. It's just the strangest. I don't know if it's the editing or the camera work or if that was really how it went down, but I was laughing at that the entire time.
Yeah, it's I see it as him sort of, trying to create sort of friendly competition with his girlfriend and support her. It's totally fine to do something like that, but yeah, it is just a little bit cringe. It's a little bit awkward.
So, I would say I definitely really enjoyed day 6. We had the Phil Collins show for the first half, and then we had this sort of variety pack of Doc Sands, Erica, Ben Lamb, Lindgren, Brian Yoon kind of split. So I thought it worked for me, even though, and then table 2 had a couple of big hands in there too. So, it's all I can ask for.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's playing pretty well. I mean, we didn't mention Lamb calling off a 3-barreled bluff with pocket 5s, which Phil Hellmuth, they brought in for the pro analysis, commended, as I think everyone should. I mean, it's a hell of a play against Brian Yoon. Yeah, I mean, we saw definitely a good mix of hands, plenty of personality. I mean, overall, pretty good episode.
Yeah. Day 6 ends with 57 players left. So, again, still working our way down to the number 9, not quite there yet. Episode 17 is day 7, part 1. Blinds being 30K, 60K, and in, I guess, the biggest break from formula, the blinds will raise to 40K, 80K, 2/3 into the episode, because they have to cram in as more than 4 levels into 4 episodes to make the flow of the whole day work. So table 1, we have our chip leader, Ryan Linehan, with nearly 13 million chips, which if you have seen the number 9 of this tournament, you'll see that would have been good for 8th or 9th place on the final table. So again, not amazing, but still something that you can kind of, work with and feel like, you don't have to go crazy and you might, be able to make the final 9.
Right.
John Esposito, the old school pro and of some sorts. Doc Sands, Martin Stasco, Hilton Laborda, David Bach, and a couple other players will join a bit later in the episode. We do get John Hewitt, Matt Giannetti, and Fabio Souza. So pretty good batch of players on our first table. Table 2 is kind of the greatest hits of earlier in the tournament. We got Ben Lamb, Owen O.D. is there, Sam Barnhart, Makievsky, Dark Core, and Brian Devonshire, who we didn't mention his really cool chip bridge tower on day 6.
Oh, yeah.
Worth mentioning. And this episode is actually perhaps the most segment-heavy episode we had seen the entire 2011 main event. I was making a list of how many we had, 6 or 7 bits. I mean, not all of them are all that long, but nonetheless, definitely pointed that out.
Yeah,
it turned out to me as something.
Yeah, probably my favorite segment would have been when Doc Sands is interviewed about his girlfriend's eye color, and he is unable to provide the actual answer. One of those nice moments.
That's the Simpsons episode that Homer forgot her eye color. I mean, that was just like
right, exactly.
Yeah. We do see our classic pro analysis, poker tells, interspersed among the bits. We do see one of the strangest all-ins you'll ever see, where it is a dead 50-50 split, 44 cards in the deck to come, and 22 outs for Esposito in a pretty crazy call by Ryan Lenahan on I believe on the turn, where it was a 50-50 outcome at that hand. And off screen, he had doubled up on a hand prior, so that was actually his second double up at that point. So that was a big deal, obviously, for Esposito.
Wow.
And we see on the on table 2, kind of some prime, aggressive, classic, old school bully the table poker by Anton Makievsky, who, if you ask me, definitely owned up to the reputation that Pius Heinz had more than Heinz had in the coverage, if you ask me.
Yeah, Makievsky plays pretty aggressively overall. We get the wild card hand between him and Barnard, where he's definitely bullying him around, raising, and so on. Yeah, I mean, I think, we mentioned that he's an aggressive player. We're not trying to demean him or anything. I think he played a fairly solid game, managed to chip up, find sort of spots to raise. Yeah.
And not quite as viral as past viral hands we've seen, but there's a pretty amusing Kings against Aces hand with Dark Core against Lamb, where Ben Lamb gets off so easy.
Oh my God,
it's a joke how few chips Ben Lamb loses with Kings against Dark Core's Aces. And we get the great line, "Where's your pot, buddy?" Because Dark Core kind of laments, "Oh, you know, to re-raise me before the flop." And I like that. That was funny.
Yeah, it's like the most impressive losing hand you'll ever see. Like, where you're like the player who lost, like he's more impressive than the player who won.
Galfond definitely in the pro analysis covers that in a good way, saying, if you really think you have that big an edge on the field, you don't have to play every single big hand super fast, super, aggressive, because you're trying to balance keeping yourself alive with not overdoing it.
Right. Yeah. Which is a good strategy to adopt.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the episode ends with 42 players left. So almost over a quarter of the field bust in that level, or level and a half, I guess. Episode 18 is where, again, our favorite subplot of day 6 comes back, with Motino joining the featured table with Doc Sands with 30-something players left, which is, forget being at the same table. This far in the main event, that's pretty incredible that a couple would be. I mean, we saw them as Rocky Brothers, the 4 of them only the Grinder really made this deep a run in the tournament.
True, yeah.
And this dynamic of them being table mates, they're side by side at the featured table. I remember watching the Raw live coverage where after a hand, they'd kind of do this post-hand couple conference where they'd like huddle and be like, "Oh, I had this, oh, I had that, okay." And then sit back down. It was pretty funny. I mean, they obviously had talked about it beforehand, because they did that pretty regularly until they were actually spoken to by a tournament official and told not to do it.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that makes sense that they can't do that.
There was actually one hand where it was blind versus blind. Motina shoved from the small blind onto Doc Sands' big blind, and Doc Sands quickly folded. And
wow.
That was I think that was the catalyst of that sequence.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So this was an episode, whereas I thought episode 17 was the rise of Dark Core, Laborda, and Esposito. This episode was the fall of Laborda, Dark Core, and Tony Hashem as well.
Yep, Tony Hashem, who previously chewed out Ben Lamb. He loses to She, of all people, who we didn't talk about in the previous episode, has the single most nervous temperament of a poker player I think I've ever seen. Like, he takes off his hat, he gets up off the table. I want to just pat the guy on the back and tell him everything's going to be okay. He's so nervous.
I almost forgot. We had Alex Silvestri in the first part of day 7 with hand exposure gates, where he had inadvertently exposed his hand, even though it was pretty clear that he was getting called by Philip Grusom. And the whole entire table did not want him to get a penalty. And yet, I guess collusion, you can't really just have, even if the whole table doesn't want something to happen, the floorman has to make the fair ruling. But a 1-round penalty, like, that's brutal. I'm not, like, one hand maybe or something. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that was really horrible. I mean, he wins the hand, but he would have lost something like 15% of his chips sitting out that 1 round, which again, we're playing fairly short going down to the final 3 tables. I mean, that's devastating at that stage.
Yeah.
And you can tell how frustrated he is. I mean, he just walks away from the table. He like throws his jacket down on the ground and then walks off. Crazy.
We see some very bloated pots on table 2 where Makiespi makes a 4-bet shove of 9-6 suited, where Devonshire's only response would be, my head's still exploding. Makiespi, his timing of his all-ins on that table was just on point the whole day.
Yeah.
And that takes balls, and I guess he was living on borrowed time because he had that 1-outer on day 5. So he's like, you know what? I'm free rolling anyway. Who cares?
Yeah, happy for him.
We do see, again, a very salty dark core when he learns that his kings are dominated by aces of Devonshire. Basically, you get the perfect contrast of the Ben Lamb dark core hand, aces against kings, whereas when you play kings too aggressively, in the same way, you're going to hit some troubled waters there.
Yeah, that's just kings versus aces. I mean, that's just the scourge at this point in the tournament. It always happens every year, and it's just never pleasant to see. Even if Dark Core's been a little, shall I say, uncouth with his behavior at the table, it's just yeah, gross.
But probably one of the most memorable hands of the entire tournament for me is the infamous Hilton Laborda, Matt Gianetti, flush against full house hand for 12 million chips, where pretty much Laborda guarantees he loses a maximum, where Matt Gianetti, who at this point he'd been pretty quiet and kind of the stoic poker pro, we kind of see a little bit of that cocky, arrogant, I knew what he had, that's why I trapped him, even though
Right.
he could not have possibly have known that when he was behind on the flop anyway.
Oh my God, it's just so painful. Like, oh my God. And Laborda even commits forward motion, so he has to put the chips in. Like, it's just like, oh, such a painful hand.
And at this point, he was characterized as the flag-wearing foreigner by Norman Lawn. And again, his behavior had been borderline unethical, not unethical, but just kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
Etiquette at this point. And so he's not a villain, but he's not a hero. So he's kind of this, I was kind of rooting for it to happen, even though I wasn't. It was kind of painful to see happen. But I mean, as awful as that hand goes for Laborda, the very next hand against Gianetti is just as cruel, where Gianetti has a full house and Laborda rivers the nut flush and ends up busting in pretty disgusting fashion. I mean, he went from one of the chip leaders, I think he was the chip leader actually at one point, to out in just a couple of hours.
Yeah, he was the chip leader to begin the episode with 12 million in chips. I mean, in 2 hands, he's gone.
And it all goes to Gianetti.
Yeah, and Gianetti, I mean, Phil Hellmuth gives the pro analysis for the first Laborda Gianetti hand and points out that Gianetti was, very sort of even-keeled, playing very tight. Laborda didn't have the nut flush that time. Obviously had the nut flush this time, but you have to be able to read the other people at the table. You can't just be throwing chips around. It's just such a gross spot. I mean, boats versus flushes are always just a gross spot, but I think he could have gotten away from that.
I agree. Yeah. So that kind of wraps a very busy, chaotic episode for sure.
Yeah.
The second half of day 7 is just as brutal because we see the poker's dream couple with 32 left. They go out in consecutive fashion in 30th and 29th. Latino does start off the episode doubling up in a pretty good spot with the pair over and under pair pre-flop all in against Datsko, who does win some of it back where Martino makes a pretty awful fold with a pair and a flush draw against Statsko. And so again, this is really the only hand we ever see Martino play where she wasn't all in pre-flop. So
that's true.
Doesn't leave the best taste in your mouth as far as what her poker style or what brought her to day 7 in the first place, how she got there at all.
Yeah, and this was really Martino's best tournament performance. I think she had a couple other cashes, but this was sort of her one. It would have been nice to have seen a little bit more of what her style of play was like.
Yeah. But to be fair, we do see Doc Sands, in my opinion, completely blow it, shoving Jack 10 pre-flop, 18 big blinds at this point. The blinds 60K, 120K, and Norm gets in a great edited line, "Jack 10, you idiot!" as it flashes to Martino's face during the sort of the hand card reveal.
Yeah.
So he was on 30th place, and then Martino, in just 26 minutes later in real time, shoves Queen 10, another awful shove if you ask me, and goes out just in consecutive order as Doc Sands. Painful.
Yeah, it is painful, yeah. But at least they were able to just stay together for a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, they were there for the majority of day 7 up till that point. So that had to be novelty. The problem was they were both very short stacked the whole day. So even in the raw footage of day 7, for them, it was pretty much all just folding pre-flop or the occasional all-in. No one calls, and they take the blinds and earnings down. So they were really, particularly at this chip-heavy table, you had Giannetti, Laborda, and Lenehan all with well over 10 million chips for the majority of that day. So when they have, this 1.8, 2 million chip stacks, it really does handcuff what you can do, which really speaks to how important it is to keep yourself chip healthy at all points in a tournament, unless you're going to hit some big hands in quick order.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we mentioned Statsko earlier. I mean, this, he's sort of floated a little bit in and out. I mean, I think we've seen him sort of in the background a couple of times. We get a segment from him sort of talking about the final table. Seems like a decent guy. This is sort of the first time that, now the characters from the November 9 that we're about to see are starting to sort of come into a little bit more focus. In this episode, we see Pius Heinz double up. We see Bernard double up again as he's moving over to the rail. Pretty good moment. We see Sam Holden pop up. He also doubles up. So we're now starting to see a little bit in terms of the narrative that will go into the November 9, the final table. We're starting to sort of see that build in this episode a little bit.
And what is commonly considered in the top 5 best hands of the 2011 main event, we see the worst time bluff award for Mr. J.P. Kelly against Kenny Shee, where Kenny Shee flops quads and J.P. Kelly could not stop himself from bluffing of king high. And we get the great line from Norm, "Kelly's outs are listed at the top of the screen," in a 10 million chip pot that ends up really crippling Kelly going forward and carrying Shee well into day 8.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great Norm lines. I think one of my favorite Norm lines possibly ever is, she is going to call without breathing or shifting any part of his body. So good. It's one of those just unseemly hands. Oh, man.
And then usually the last day of the tournament before the final table is the final 3 tables playing down to 9, or playing down to 27. But because they had not played a full day's worth of poker, they elected to play one more level and for day 7, which is why episode 20 is still day 7, part 4 now, with 27 left. And the plan was, according to the poker blogs, to either play down to 18 or play one full level, whichever one happened first. In this case, it was the full level, because they go down from 27 players down to 22, which is interesting because it really changes the dynamics of that last day. And so often, because the pay jumps at this point in the tournament are by when one table goes out, the whole field goes up. So every 9 eliminations, you have a pay jump. So that does eliminate some, ICM money, watch the payout boards component of that last day of the tournament.
Yeah, I mean, the payout structure at this point, I mean, it's like, what, 60K for each table?
The pay jumps?
Yeah, the pay jumps.
Something like that.
Yeah.
They pretty regularly do update the audience in the broadcast of what is the latest pay jump or how many spots until the next pay jump, which when again we're down to the final 10 tables or less, that is definitely something I think is worth mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we got a brand new featured table and table 2 because they kind of swap the first table and table 2. But again, there's only 3 tables left. So at this point, we're familiar with pretty much all the players that are left, more or less.
Yeah.
So I personally think that this episode is a bit blah. I mean, it's kind of anticlimactic after some of the fun of Day 7's part 2 and part 3.
Mm-hmm.
We lose 5 players, JP Kelly being one of them. And we do see the biggest pot of the main event up until this point, this Moore versus Makievsky 20 million chip pot where Makievsky flops a full house against trips. And Makievsky plays it, I guess according to Phil Galfond, perfectly because he's playing his bluff the same as he played a strong hand, which I guess for Makievsky would be in character, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, if it was me, I don't think I go as crazy as Moore did. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I mean, how the action goes is Mock raises pre-flop to 400K, Moore calls, Mock leads out for 400, Moore is about 1.1, then Makievsky 3-bets it to 2 million, Moore then makes it 2.9 million, Makievsky shoves, Moore calls. Yeah, I mean, at that point, when Makievsky shoves, I think he can get away from it. I don't know.
I agree. I mean, it's hard because would he really go all in with a bluff?
Yeah.
I guess his only hope was he was playing a weaker trips, maybe like a weaker jack or something. But with that many chips at risk here, I just think you can't do that. You just can't do that.
Yeah, same here. Even
if it's Makievsky, because let's not forget that the majority of these big hands Makievsky was out bluffing the table with. These cards aren't revealed to the table, so it's not like they know what he was doing at that point.
Yeah.
So, and I was definitely let down that we did not get the entire chip counts of the whole field, as is so often the standard with 27 left.
Yeah.
Because even if it's not day 8, I feel like that's something that is still worth showing because of 3 tables to show 9, 9, 9. It's nice and clean. It's clear. And given how regularly they're already showing the featured tables chip counts, all you're doing is adding basically the third table's chip counts into there, and I don't think that's too much trouble to do.
Yeah, I would have liked that as well. Yeah, especially because it's always interesting to me to see one of the short stacks go on a run. I mean, we've talked about this in the past, how it seems like on, with the final 3 tables, there's usually like a short stack, maybe 20th place or so that manages to make the final table. I always like to see that narrative, and a great way of just building that is just showing what the chip counts are.
Yeah. As day 7 ends with 22 players, I took note that of the top 8 that they show, only 4 of them will actually make the final table.
Wow.
So again, we're going to see some of those, chip destructive blowups as the countdown to the final 9 happens, but 50%, that's pretty severe. That's pretty high.
Yeah, absolutely.
So day 8, as we said, 22 players left, playing down to 9. We get 4 episodes of day 8, which this is the last time day 8 exists in the tournament in that form.
Right.
Going forward, the main event will always be compressed into 7 days before the final table. And days 6 and 7 can sometimes drag on for a long time to get us to the appropriate number of players left. So with 22 left, it's pretty easy to look up all 3 tables, player breakdown. Table 1, again, this will only be 3 tables left for this one episode. Then episode 2 will bring us down to the final 2 tables. So not as important to go into who's at what table, but we do get the first of what I think are very beautifully shot interview biopic sort of segments of some of the remaining players, and a little bit of misdirection at this first one because the first one is of Brian Devonshire. We see him as a cowboy. The camera quality is gorgeous. Like compared to the filmography that we've seen in the past, this is some pretty high quality camera work.
And yeah, I mean, they actually went out to his ranch in Colorado and got some shots, which looks really good. Before, we've just had, them in front of a green screen talking, which, okay, it's fine. We get some quick information about the players, but it's nice to actually show them out in their natural element.
Yes.
Yeah.
And not to mention that you would think, logically speaking, that if they were going to go to the trouble of going out to Colorado and film Devonshire in his home, that he must be one of the final 9, right? Because you would think they would know to do that in the hindsight, knowing that he's going to be in the final 9, and that just makes sense for making more coverage of that. But then it occurred to me, I guess they're probably just picking all the Americans that are left, because I guess it's such a diverse, non-international field that maybe that was part of the thought process behind that in general.
Yeah, and Devo's also, a fairly personable guy, so you might want to pick one of the more personal players. They did go out to Bob Bunara's country of Belize, so there was that.
Yes, in a couple episodes we will see that. So that is true. So that's true. This episode is very much kind of a business as usual episode. We don't actually see a lick of Table 3 until the 2/3 mark of the episode. We do see a 12.5 million chip pot with queens, kings, and aces, which is always exciting if you ask me. How that works out with 20 players left or so is pretty cool.
Yeah. Oh, God, so messy. Jeez.
And so I think just moving on to, by episode's end, we're down to our final 2 tables. And those 2 tables are definitely more kind of locked in as far as who is at what table for the rest of day 8. So that is worth noting as well. The blinds being 100K, 200K for the first 2/3 of the episode, and then they go up for the last third to 120K, 240K. So again, this is all happening in the first 2 hours of action on day 8 is the first 1/3 of the day 8 episode breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the live feed broadcast version of this main event, they were commenting on the speed of the bust outs and how fast things were progressing, and how they thought this will probably lead to a substantial slowdown in the action as the chip stacks are deeper, given that there are fewer players to go around for those chips to go to. So this first table, we have Patachuk, Ben Lamb, Sam Holden, Lenahan, Heinz, Giannetti, Bunara, Makieski, who is up to 33 million chips, which they mention they're often referring to what the chip average will be at the final table as kind of a meter of where you need to be in relation to the field. And so Makieski, 33 million, that is good for 10 million above the chip average of the final table. So that's very, very comfortable. And given how often 1 or 2 players kind of hog the top of the meter, that's good for at least second place chips, no doubt, if you can last with that many chips going forward.
Absolutely.
Sadly, we do lose nice guys like Sam Barnhart and even Andre Patachuk, who I think got one of the most bizarre edits of all time, because he is a pretty silent guy, and he pops up fairly regularly, and he loses more hands than he wins, but he's always shown with lots of chips. So it was interesting to see this guy kind of get a lot of respect in the edit, but also kind of no respect in the edit.
Yeah, that's true.
I didn't think it was a very memorable episode, this one. I did find some of the little table talk moments amusing, like OD against Devo. Devo calls Kings. Wow. Gets totally fooled by OD. But not my favorite.
I'd say my favorite table talk moment is right at the start of the episode when Lamb's talking about going to Turks and Caicos, how he was supposed to go on vacation, but he didn't think he'd last that long, so now he has to cancel it. I thought that was a nice moment.
I agree, but I didn't think it was all that episode.
Yeah, I'm with you.
This is kind of what I'm referring to. This is kind of this and the last couple of episodes were kind of in that grind kind of part of the episode for me.
Yeah, I mean, there's enough natural tension going down from the final 2 tables into the final table that I'm able to sort of just hang in there, but I'm with you. There's nothing special.
And even this next episode, kind of in that same category, with just 14 players left, even with Ben Lamb lamenting his chance at the 14th place bubble that he faced in 2009. And, Ben Lamb is actually he's pretty amusing. I had forgotten how personable and kind of dry humor entertaining he was in this main event. He kind of mirrors Bunara's body posturing in a hand, which is pretty funny because Bunara has this very deliberate kind of half statue, half don't give anything away sort of vibe to him when he plays in a hand.
Yeah.
Bob Winara, this is, again, kind of one of his more spotlight episodes. We see him in the most bizarre wild card hand decision of all time to play 7-2 against Matt Giannetti, and pretty much plays it as badly as you can. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, what is like he bets 1.2 after the flop with 7 deuce. Just crazy.
at one point, Mr. John Hewitt has 27 million chips with 13 players left. Just keep that in mind for a little bit later, okay, folks? We see Mama Lealdis shoving 8-2, or is it 8-8, all in pre-flop. I personally don't believe him for a second that he misread his hand. I'm convinced he just wanted to take the blinds down and move on to the next hand. I don't know how you thought about that.
Yeah, I thought so too, because he held his cards out because they showed the whole cam, and he had his like cards out kind of like this. So it's like, yeah, like how can you mistake like 2-8s for that? You have to look at that and see that it's 8 deuce. Yeah. Like I just don't get it.
Unless maybe his eyes didn't work for his brain that moment. You know, maybe his brain didn't read what he saw. But I have
no idea.
It's one of those ambiguous spots, which, you know, everyone hates in movies, but I don't know. We'll see. He busts in 13th place in the main event, misreading his cards. Like, read your hand twice before you go all in.
Exactly.
Even if you do that to your hand, you should probably look at your hand twice just to be 100% before you go all in.
Yeah, it's a weird spot.
And speaking of weird spots, possibly the longest hand of the entire main event is the infamous, if you ask me, the 3-2 ace-9 Ben Lamb Matt Giannetti hand, where Ben Lamb somehow hits trip twos on the river, and Matt Giannetti tanks for over 10 minutes on live television originally before the episode broadcast, before making a ultimately incorrect call.
Yeah, it's a rough spot.
It's a rough spot, and if you can ever find the raw footage of that hand, Matt Giannetti has his hat up. He like tips it up and hits it back down. He's talking to himself, like, my first instinct was to call, now it's to throw it in the muck. It's one of those hands where you probably, as much as Giannetti, are wavering in your head 5 or 6 times before you are figuring out what Ben Lamb has.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those spots where, yeah, maybe someone should have called the clock.
But with 12 players left, can you really blame them? Because
I can't blame them.
And so, again, we have 2 bust outs in this hand on table 2. That was kind of the death table with two-handed play left, as the final 4 eliminations before the bubble of the final table were all on table 2. Basically, OD and Makieski kind of corralling that table in that respect chip-wise.
Yeah, OD really sort of takes off on day 8, really sort of chipping up, knocking out a bunch of players. He's been mentioned before sort of on day 7, but this is really his day where he goes on a run.
Yeah. And so day 8, part 4, the final 12 playing down to 9. This is really the first episode of day 8 that I can really get behind.
Yeah.
Because it is that the last little hurdle before the final table. And we also get the most chronologic poker shown in this episode, because they begin at the 150, 300K level. They completely skip the 200, 400K level and then go to 250, 500K at the very end.
Really?
Yeah, I looked it up.
Wow.
No one cares, right? So John Hewitt is in the top 3 in the chip counts, and you would think he's a lock to him at the final table, right? There's no way he'll miss it. This is really the John Hewitt show. And for better or for worse, that's what this episode is.
Just buddy.
It's not only it's the John Hewitt show, it's the off-screen downfall of Makieski show, because don't forget, he was at 33 million chips at one point on day 8.
Yeah.
The final play down to the final 9 at just 13.8 million.
Yeah, and something we should mention is, like, you know, Stotsko, seen him do a little bit. You see him have a couple hands sort of on day 8, but he goes on a tear and eventually becomes the chip leader going into the final table. But he's barely in the coverage on this episode in particular, which I thought, like, I would have liked to have seen, like, what exactly he did to chip up.
A lot of it was off screen, especially on the final 10 onward. He was winning quite a few hands off screen.
Yeah, I know. I would like to have seen that.
We see enough donk plays by John Hewitt to fill a YouTube compilation. To start off with, he gets super unlucky in a 16 million chip all-in against Pius Heinz, being 5 out on the river. So you can't really blame John Hewitt for that. So he goes down from like 20-something million down to like 18, 16 million or something like that. So, oh well. But he makes a couple of insane all-ins. First of all, shoving for 12 million with ace jack instead of 18 million against Ben Lamb, who is just like laughing to himself like, what the heck is this guy doing when he folds? He has this awful habit of like stretching like, how much is it? Okay, I call. With like these mediocre hands. I mean, I guess he was exhausted. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, he calls Bunara's all in. After Bunara, by the way, folds queens when Giannetti shoves, which I think is an insta-call. But anyway, Bunara shoves, Hewitt calls, and just like, it just cuts around the table, and just the looks of disbelief on everyone's face after Hewitt calls is just like, it's unbelievable. Like, it's so open how everyone's just like, how did you make that call? And Hewitt's down to like 3.9 million. Like, it's crazy.
So that was Bunara shoving kings while John Hewitt had king queen, just
right.
begging for a flip. Of
Yeah.
course, not a flip. But that was only the fourth like questionable shove by John Hewitt that episode. He also calls off a third of his shits of ace 10 against Giannetti's pocket jacks. He goes on with ace 4 against two other players in the hand, which was, by the way, his second shove after doubling Giannetti the first time. And Ben Lamb does give a courtesy double up to Giannetti as well with king 9 against Giannetti's 2 jacks. So a lot of players trying to get to the final 9 and maybe being a little overly aggressive. Ben Lamb and John Hewitt being the two most guilty of that. They could have had a lot more chips as play continued. But again, it's for me probably the most pathetic fail 10th place finish for somebody of all time. As much as I might hate somebody else like Goldberg in 06, at least that was only one hand.
Yeah, Goldberg, it was one hand. He was trying to steal the blinds, and that's what he got called. Yeah, Hewitt, for a 10th place finish, it's the worst blow-up. For an 11th place finish, on the other hand.
Well, I mean, are you referring to Kwon Win, or are you referring to next year?
I'm referring to Scotty Wynn.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, there's too many 11th place finishes that are painful to remember. So
that is true. Yeah,
remember all of them. I can't remember all of them. So as it turned out, bubble play of the final 10 playing down to 9 lasted almost 4 hours of play.
Jeez. Oh.
So everyone's exhausted. Probably John Hewitt looked the most tired of all. He was just, his eyes, you can see like the bags in his eyes. He was like, his eyes are like half open. I mean, he was like, how much is it? 8.5? I call. Like, just not a good look for him at all.
Yeah, he gassed out.
Yeah.
Ugh.
So I think before we discuss the final table, I think it's important to go over all 9 players and how well we had seen them, how well we know them. Obviously, we've said how Ben Lamb is the de facto main character of the coverage.
Yep.
But I feel like this is probably the most balanced and most in-depth we've seen players, and particularly put up their poker at the very least.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, Giannetti and Collins, I think there's no debate. We both know them fairly well. Their play, I mean, they're not the most personable people, but though they do have a couple segments here and there. Collins, it's mainly his name. Giannetti talks about him, like, all I do is play poker. Again, it's no problem. At least they're not like hamming up to the camera to try to get screen coverage. But yeah, we definitely have a good sense of their play. Heinz, we have.
Yeah, Makieski being the young, aggressive, not afraid to go for it kind of player. We did get a couple of other very nicely shot hometown footage bits with Giannetti and Phil Collins, much like the Devonshire one, where again, it's nice to see that sort of thing because the segments in 2011 are pretty short altogether. So even though they might have a few more, small short interviews, these little splashes of these players adds more flavor to their character for sure.
Yeah, and I'd say, Heinz, we've talked about how sort of his image is the crazy German aggressive player. We see a couple of hands from him. Mock, we've seen a couple of hands from him. Stotsko and OD, OD I'd say more so than Stotsko has been characterized. And, mainly for OD, it's because he's the son of Donegal OD, who's this huge Irish, like probably the most famous Irish poker player of all time, has made 2 final tables. Stodsko, yeah, I mean, we get, I want to make the final table. He seems more of a
Who doesn't?
Huh?
Who doesn't?
Yeah, exactly. Who doesn't? I mean, I'd say the only one of these 9 that we really don't have any sense of is Holden. Holden, we get like one moment earlier where he goes like, I used my one time, and that's about it. He was the short stack.
The short stack, he never really was in a major chip stack at any point in the tournament. Everybody else was pretty much a big stack at one point, besides Bernard, really. And then, so yeah, I would say 6 out of 9 are very solid coverage, and 2 middling, better than a lot of other past main events for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. So yeah, this is probably the most even that we've seen of the
I
year.
think that part of that definitely speaks to the bit more balanced nature of this style of coverage, of the sort of live feel to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not to mention, we saw them all go through what was, in my opinion, probably one of the much more exciting final table bubbles that we've had.
Yeah.
Number of hands we saw was pretty substantial, and everybody was, a shot of their faces when someone's all in. Oh no, are we going to make it? It was a nice little countdown for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as is the standard, we have a 2-episode final table. The first part gets us from the final 9 down to 4. We do see a very enjoyable introduction, kind of first 3 minutes of the episode. We see Lamb costumes for Ben Lamb. We see the Sam Holdenwigs in the crowd, which is kind of that Dennis Phillips trucker vibe for the crowd, as we kind of saw in the past. We see a very nice live sort of feel to the coverage of Lon Norm's talking at the start of the episode, with everyone kind of in the background of them, and sort of professional Monday Night Football introductions of each player before the action begins.
Yeah, so each player gets to sort of say their, Pius Heinz, I have 15 million in chips, and give a little blurb. It's always nice. Yeah, the thing about Lon and Norm doing it, live, they're standing by the table, they've got the microphones, kind of like being on the sideline at a football game or something. The crowd was so loud that it's like you could barely hear them. It was really weird.
Which, again, isn't completely unlike a sideline reporter at a football game or something like that. So it's, it felt authentic for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just weird to see that at a poker tournament of all things. Expect that at like the Super Bowl, but like a poker tournament, it's just funny.
So looking at the chip breakdown of the final table, we had Martin Statsko with 40 million chips, almost 1/5 of the total chips in play. So a very solid chip leader. Owen OD, 6 million behind in second place, still very solid. And then a fair drop, but for a third place, but third, fourth, and fifth kind of in that same chip ballpark. The blinds would actually begin in the 300K, 600K level. So this is actually a pretty short stacked final table compared to past, which I attribute partially to just how long that bubble for the final table down to the 9 actually was.
Mm-hmm.
And the bottom 2 stacks, still not super terrible. I mean, 20 big blinds, 23 big blinds is not as bad as we've seen for that last place in past final tables, but still something that it kind of handcuffs you in your ability to play. And Mr. Pius Heinz actually in 7th place with 8% of the total chips. So a little bit above where Joe Yang was, who was in 8th place in 07, but still you would never assume that he would be the lock to win the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot of the coverage at the time was focused on Ben Lamb. Obviously Owen OD also being the son of Donegal OD. I mean, I'm sure like those 2 are probably the ones expected to go deep and win this. Yeah, and Heinz was just on no one's radar.
Yeah. So as I have done before, I made a note of each hand in each episode of the final table, what hand number it was. And to my surprise, the very first hand we see is hand number 30.
Oh.
So they skip the first 3 orbits plus of the whole coverage to get to the nitty gritty. But that also tells you that nobody had busted yet in the first 30 hands. I mean, how often have we seen a big firework explosion in the first orbit where someone goes out very early on, and that sort of gets the adrenaline flowing in the action, but not this time.
Yeah.
And the kind of the defining hand of possibly the whole final table is this crazy hand number 39, Owen OD against Pius Heinz, where OD gives up over half his chips to Heinz, and that really kind of keeps things where they will be for the rest of the final table, as far as Heinz being a chip leader and OD being a middling sort of stack going forward.
Yeah, I think that's the one hand I've seen the live coverage of in some compilation. And it's just incredible to hear like Esfandiari's like, oh, O and OD looks really, really strong. You're like zooming in on OD's face. Because OD's got a great poker face. Like it's just pure blank. He's just staring forward. And then Heinz shoves and OD's face just completely changes. Like he just loses all confidence just all of a sudden and then folds. And it's just like, it's like night and day almost the change. And that, yeah, I mean, it was Heinz just got a bunch of chips and he was able to just play hardball.
Yeah. And so the first four hands or three hands we see nobody has busted. And then finally in the fourth hand, we see Sam Holden bust in hand number 51 at the whole final table with that cursed ace jack. I swear, if I ever get to a final table, I'm folding ace jack every single time. I don't care what the situation is because ace jack is cursed. And that was the very first hand of level 400K, 800K at that point in the tournament. And I just, poor Sam Holden, he was short stacked. He made it, again, 50 hands is pretty good to last when you're in the bottom of the pecking order at that point, but out in ninth place. And he is unfortunately the only player at this final table to not be a millionaire. He gets only $782,000. I know, only, right?
Only, yeah. And he doesn't get to earn any money because you get the ninth place payout and then that's it. So, it's all, crazy.
Yeah. And then as we often see where the bottom two or three stacks are kind of the first couple to go, Makieski, who we, again, saw 33 million chips on day 8, he goes out in 8th place in a very back and forth fashion against Pius Heinz, King Jack against nines and a flip for it all. And the young gun also meets his fate. But $1 million, so at least he, is a millionaire.
Yeah, Heinz hits a 9 on the turn, and it's like a shockwave through Makievsky. It's really painful. It's like, ugh.
Yeah. And then our favorite amateur, Bob Bonara, kind of blows it, if you ask me. He shoves ace-5 against Stasko with ace-9. I think playing one-card poker, you just can't do that. There's no reason to do that.
I'm with you. Yeah.
It's silly. Bob Bonara, this was actually an important moment in Esfandiari's history because Esfandiari, being part of the broadcast team, would actually meet Bob's daughter, Amal Bonara, and they would later end up getting married and having a family together.
No kidding. I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I believe in 2019 or so, they would both make a deep main event run, Amal and Esfandiari. So that's kind of cool.
Oh, wow. Very sweet.
Mm-hmm. So, again, we've lost our first 3. We have 6 left, kind of 4 haves and 2 have-nots on the chip count. Phil Collins gets lucky in a big hand against Ben Lamb. Again, Phil Collins, we don't really see a ton of Phil Collins up until this point of the hands. And Ben Lamb gets pretty unlucky, losing half his stack.
Yeah.
But, Phil Collins does kind of give some chips back in a wild card hand showdown against Pius Heinz. Yeah, I'm always kind of amused when they go wild card hand for the final table. It doesn't really work for me, even though it should work,
I know, right? I thought that was a little weird.
I mean, it was on theme, but with the whole season being one continuous broadcast. But nonetheless, it just didn't quite work for me. From a taste feel of that.
Yeah, I know. It's like no huge deal, but
it's a minor blip on the radar. But as we're mentioning, ONOD somehow has enough chips to call Ben Lamb's all-in pre-flop later on, despite his chip problems later. And Ben Lamb does hit the river, which again he had for the most part not required on luck too much in the main event to really accumulate chips, but here he's winning a couple of hands in these lucky spots where he's able to thrive.
Yeah, and then OD bust shortly afterward. Sort of the guy we mentioned this, how there's sort of like a big stack. Usually he's like second in chips or so to start the table, and then he just kind of like blow it and finish in like 6th or 7th. OD is sort of that.
That was kind of John Dolan in 2010. He kind of fits that same role with OD in 6th place here.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's worth mentioning that the entire final table takes 303 hands, which I think is definitely on the much higher side than what we normally see from these final tables. Up until this point, getting down from 9 players down to 5, it's been 99 hands. So we're a little under 1/3 of the hands played, but we're only halfway in the eliminations.
Mm-hmm.
But the very next hand after OD busts, Phil Collins busts.
Yeah.
Number 100.
Jeez.
So Phil Collins, again, kind of too loose at that ace-7. I mean, I know it's an ace-5-handed, but I don't know about that.
Yeah, wait for a better spot.
Wait for a better spot. And so, again, we get a pretty nice breakdown. We get from 9 down to 4. We do actually, this is the episode where we do see Bob Bonara and Belize. And again, another beautifully shot, beautiful locale for that interview. And so it's nice that they didn't just stick to America for these segments, at least for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think because again, he's sort of the one true amateur of the final table. There's always one. You got to do something a little bit for that. I love the way he introduces himself in that segment. He goes, "Bob Dunara, 49 years young." This is great. Nice little touch of personality.
Yeah. So I thought that it was a little strange that for episode 26, the final 4 down to 1, they didn't just do the natural break where day 2 of the final table itself was the final 3 onward. So
I know.
if you notice, you'll see that the clothing of the final 3 does change after Giannetti's bust out in 4th place, which is to reflect the next day of which the play began after that.
Yeah, I thought that was weird as well.
Yeah,
I don't know why they made that decision.
But I guess they wanted to have the same number of hands and just the way that. But then they could have had to be one large 2-part episode. So I don't know.
I don't know either.
But anyway, the very first hand of this last part is arguably the coolest, craziest play of the final table so far, where Ben Lamb has 4 high and does a 4-bet play against Statsko to win the pot. That was pretty badass.
Yeah, and Statsko didn't really have a big hand, did he?
Mm.
Did he have like 10 high or something?
I thought that the actual play on part 2 was definitely more exciting than part 1. We had some crazier bluff attempts and some, pretty high-level stuff happen, whereas part 1 was a bit more standard, as it has to squeeze in 5 bust outs amongst the 12 hands shown. So that's fewer hands to show these, outplaying each other and chip distribution and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see Ben Lamb get super lucky against Giannetti, and a surprisingly large celebration by Ben Lamb. The hand's over. So that I had the wrong image of him in my head, I guess, as far as him being that sort of stoic pro that didn't make too much of a splash in his celebrations.
Yeah, he found his moments. I mean, he's not like Umberto Brenes, who's just euphoric all the time, but he definitely has those little moments.
Mm-hmm. Giannetti actually busts in hand number 178 to Ben Lamb, where Ben Lamb flops quads, which is pretty crazy. And so then let's not forget. So the very next day is when they resume play after Giannetti plays, and the very first hand of that last day is Statsko doubling up with the 7s against Ben Lamb's King Jack pre-flop shove.
Crazy.
And then just 3 hands later, Ben Lamb busts with Queen 6, which is what, if you were paying attention to my introduction, I was referencing there, because that hand ultimately shapes the flow of heads-up play with Statsko having a big chip lead when heads-up begins.
Yeah, I mean, it's so sick to see that flip, because, this had been the year of Ben Lamb. He was player of the year. They did mention, that he was the leader of the player of the year, I think, earlier in the final table coverage. He wins that flip. I mean, Ben Lamb, I don't know, against Pius Heinz, I think Lamb probably wins. So it's just a crazy sort of, not exactly an ICM nightmare or anything. I mean, finishing 3rd is fine, especially because Lamb was not 3rd when he started the final table. But man, it's just like one of those what-if moments.
Well, to be fair, Ben gets $4 million for 3rd place. That's pretty good for 3rd place payouts, because
of course.
Back in 2007, we had Tuan Lamb for 2nd place get $4.8 million. And so to hit that 4 million mark in this era of the main event, still pretty good.
Yeah, of course.
And so heads-up play, this was for the longest time kind of the longest heads-up final table showdown at that point, while Darby Moon and Joe Ketta had a pretty lengthy one. This one actually topped it in number of hands played. I
Yeah,
believe the official count was like 120 hands or so, 121 hands.
something like that. Yeah.
And Statsko, for the most part of it, he pretty much had a pretty strong hammerlock on this matchup. He was definitely tirelessly playing the right kind of poker against Pius Heinz's aggressive tendencies.
Yeah, I mean, it went back and forth a couple times. Apparently, we remember reading like, people were thinking that Statsko, wasn't going to be able to adjust, wasn't going to do that good heads up. But yeah, I mean, like at one point, like Heinz was down to something like 55 million. Like Statsko was doing very, very well in terms of playing heads up, and it just sort of went the other way at the end.
And as you might expect with a lengthy heads up play, you're not going to see every single hand, but
No.
I took a look at the actual hand numberings of the hands they did show. So the first hand in heads up they show is 206, which was 24 hands after the Ben Lamb bus. Then 211, then 228, and then it goes to 293.
Wow. Okay.
They jump ahead almost 60, like 65 hands, and that is the big double up for Heinz that really kind of seals the deal more or less, where they both go in on the flop of a draw versus a different draw, and 10 hands later, Statsko does that pretty awful 10-7 shove. I'm sorry, there's no defending that one, I think, and ends up losing. But I would say that episode 2 was definitely stronger than episode 1 at the final table.
Yeah, I'm with you. It was, I mean, again, you have the natural tension of, seeing who's going to win, what's heads up going to be like. That's obviously helping it. But yeah, I mean, this was I'm really glad that they gave time to heads up, that they gave a few hands to see both Statsko and Heinz play well heads up.
By far the best representation of the heads up play, how it played out relative to what we saw on the screen.
Yeah.
And I would say it's a shame that future heads up final tables will give us an expanded look at heads up play. Some would maybe do fewer than 5 hands or more than 5 hands. Some episodes in 2013 we'd have the entire second half be heads up, which is a mixed bag as far as the execution of that. But definitely compared to one hand, the winner ends up losing, and then they win the whole thing on the next one. This was definitely a step in the right direction.
10 times better, yeah.
And so I would say the player I feel the worst for as far as how they finished would be Giannetti, because he played arguably the most consistent, tight, and solid poker of the bunch, and got unlucky in a couple of key spots when he had the chips to really kind of stay at the top of the table for a long period of time.
Yeah, I'm with you. Giannetti and OD are the two ones that I'm like, yeah.
Well, OD, he made some mistakes.
Yeah,
he had the second most chips, and I think he was even close to the chip lead, maybe the chip leader at one point in time early on in the first few orbits.
Yeah, I mean, Giannetti's the one that I'm more sympathetic to, but OD is within that tier.
Yeah. And so, and then obviously OD kind of fits that biggest letdown given where he began sort of position.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of wraps up the 2011 main event. Having discussed the whole thing, how do you feel this one ranks in your overall breakdown of all the main events we've covered so far?
Yeah, so overall, I mean, as I mentioned when we started the episode off, I got used to the style. I got used to the editing. I do appreciate that, we don't have as much as the nuts could have been, could be a nice, little break from the coverage. I like that we get, 1 or 2 more hands in. There's no, long 30, 45-second ad at the end explaining, Milwaukee's best light or whatever. I'm glad that we get more hand coverage. But on the other hand, I mean, it just feels a little less character, when you're just having the player sit in front of a green screen and talk about how much poker means to them. There's just a little bit less character there. Just having the music's not as interesting as it has been in previous years. The editing's fine. I like that it just sort of cuts quickly between tables. It'll go to sort of a 2-shot of like, the feature table and then the secondary table, and it'll just go to the secondary table, which again, saves time. But yeah, I mean, I think the editing style overall is something that I'm comfortable with, even though I'm, maybe there's just a bit of a nostalgia factor too in how I like the previous years. And then in terms of how 2011 compares to the other seasons, I'd say, yeah, I mean, I'd say this is a fairly good one. As we mentioned, everybody gets characterized fairly well. Heinz as a winner, I mean, obviously it's pretty impressive to see a sort of shorter stack chip up and, eventually win the tournament. I mean, in terms of giving it a letter grade, maybe B or so. B plus is sort of where I'm at.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that it's an A minus again, just because there just doesn't have to be. There's just not as much character. There's a little bit less soul. But nothing too wrong with it. Lon and Norm's sort of comic personas are established. Plenty of good jokes throughout. Plenty of good character moments throughout. Yeah, I mean, B plus would be sort of the letter grade I'd be assigning.
I mean, I think this season had its fair share of really viral, memorable hands. Some very memorable characters that were brand new, and also old favorites that we had. Negreanu, for example, JRB. Ben Lamb was not 100% new per se, but we didn't know him a ton in 09 back then, so
yeah.
You got a bit more of a full roundedness with him. I will 100% agree with you on the whole music thing. This was a brand new template, so they were still kind of filling in the structure of how they wanted to create this new show. You'll see music be a much more important factor in the show going forward, particularly in 2013, 2014, et cetera, going on. 2012 kind of keeps things more or less the same as this year. So there was still a ways off from them going the extra mile, spicing up this style with more flair. But I liked a lot of it. Obviously, I had a little bit of a slump in the late day 7, early day 8 portion of the coverage.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mind a ton looking back on missing days 1 and day 2, because those were more likely than not in past years among the least enjoyable episodes of those years. So it was not the worst idea to kind of move things up the timeline to focus on the meat and potatoes of the tournament. Would I put it at the very top of my list? I wouldn't quite do that. I think 05 still is my favorite. This is, again, 26 episodes. So do I think there could have been a fantastic 18 episodes? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But as is, it's still a pretty solid season. And I think if you were trying to rewatch the main events, that you wouldn't be wrong to maybe just start from 2011 onward, because a lot of the pros of the 04 of the 2010 era make very rare appearances going forward at often. So,
yeah. I mean, there's a couple of I think Marcel Lusk makes a deep run, sort of in later years. But yeah, like this is definitely the new era of poker that we're sort of starting to see from 2011 onward. And obviously, as we get into, Black Friday and stuff, sort of really changing the game.
And in a lot of ways, our next episode will cover the 2012 main event. A lot of ways that year is, in many ways, a sequel to this main event. There's a lot of same players making consecutive deep runs or playing a factor in the outcome of how poker will go going forward. And so that mean we'll get there soon. But again, I enjoy this one more than the conglomerate average of the classic World Series poker era.
Yeah, I'm with you.
I think that concludes our talk of this main event. Thank you for listening to all this stuff. We had a great response to our new format of us talking on camera instead of that awful black screen that we had before. So we're going to stick to it for now. We want to thank everyone for joining us for this look into history. Again, if you have anything you want us to talk about, comments, requests, etc., if you were in an episode and you want us to talk about your role in that episode, let us know. We're happy to include you in our show.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And, if you were in the background of one shot, we just saw the back of your head for a second, we'd like to hear from you. We're very interested in sort of how the production values evolve through time. I mean, as we mentioned, huge sort of seismic change in terms of the editing and the production values. We definitely like to hear what your perspective is on that. Feel free to ask us questions you want us to talk about, anything of that nature.
Yeah. And that's it. And we'll see you next time on the Two Fish at the Table podcast. That's all, folks.
Night-night.